Welcome to this instalment of the Society for the Environment Ends Powerlist interview series. This series aims to draw attention to and to celebrate the achievements of the UK's top 100 UK-based environmental professionals who have been named on the Ends Powerlist earlier this year for their contributions to the environmental sector from a wide range of different industries. And today it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Peter Simpson, Chartered Environmentalist, CEO of Anglian Water Group, and Honorary Fellow of the Society for the Environment. Peter.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you for asking. So could we start then, please, with an introduction into who you are and what you do?
Well, I'm Peter Simpson. I'm the Chief Executive of Anglian Water, which basically means I'm sort of the conductor at the front of this fantastic orchestra of amazing people. I joined the company back in 1989, so I've been with the company since privatisation, and I've seen an enormous change over that time. And it's a fantastic job, and I thoroughly enjoy it.
Wow, that's great to hear. I love hearing about when people enjoy their jobs, and it must have been really interesting to oversee such an exciting period of change. So leading on from that then, what's something that you think most people wouldn't know about your job?
I guess the thing I often reflect on when people are thinking about water companies is just how narrow they think what we do is. And in reality, it's very, very broad. So I would imagine that most people wouldn't think that we as a company are involved in re-wiggling rivers, for example. So putting meanders back in some of the fantastic Norfolk chalk rivers that require being put back to how they originally used to be, as opposed to the sort of canalised structures that they've become over the last few hundred years. And that's very much part of a lot of the work we're doing to improve river water quality. So probably people wouldn't realise that. They wouldn't realise that we're involved in projects where we're reintroducing beavers to help with flood defence in parts of the region. They probably wouldn't realise a lot of the work we do on carbon and the leadership role we've taken as a company around drives to net zero. They probably wouldn't even realise that the sort of scale of things we get involved with. We're planning to build 2 enormous reservoirs in the next few years. One in South Lincolnshire and one in Cambridgeshire, about the size of Grafton Water, sort of 55 billion litre structures, which give huge potential for giving back to nature and improving biodiversity, amenity, as well as ensuring public water supply, and actually, in certainly one of the reservoirs cases, helping agriculture. So I guess it's a great question, and generally people just think we sit here waiting for it to rain, and they don't really understand quite often what goes on between the rain landing and ultimately discharges to the environment. But from our point of view, we're right at the heart of the environment all the way through, and it's been fantastic to be in this industry, really, because it does stuff. We are in some ways a place-based organisation that delivers for society and the environment, and it's having that sort of geographic footprint does put us in a very privileged position.
Fantastic, thank you. That's very genuinely insightful, and I feel like we have seen in recent years the media talking more about the water industry and how this impacts the environment. So it's exciting to see what you'll do with all of those resources. So when you reflect on your career, can you think of any defining moments or experience that led you to become who you are today?
Oh, that's a really good question. I suppose very, very early on, I originally trained as a chemist, and I remember spending a lot of time sort of working on, in the laboratory, thinking about things like plastics, and it became obvious to me at that sort of time that a lot of the things we were doing actually weren't sustainable. We were generating lots of new products, but we weren't actually at that time, and whilst it might seem a long time ago, it wasn't that long ago, we weren't really thinking about what the long-term impact was, and the fact that a lot of the things we were producing weren't actually were certainly not sustainable, and certainly weren't going to biodegrade in the environment. And I suppose when I started looking for a career, that's probably one of the reasons I didn't end up going down a sort of pure chemist route, and also the fact I wasn't very good. That's probably another good reason. So I wanted to go and work in an organisation that actually would have the ability to deliver and drive environmental improvement. And I always thought water companies were right at the heart of that. And I had experience. I knew a few people already in the water industry, and in fact, my father had been in the water industry, so I got first-hand experience of the difference that was being made, and I was really excited on the cusp of privatisation back in 1989 with the environmental agenda that was being driven. Because at that time, it was pretty dire, actually. We had there was no such thing as blue flags around the East Coast beaches. River water quality was in an absolutely shocking state. Drinking water quality wasn't as good as it could be. Certainly wasn't leading in Europe as it is now. Service was really poor, and there was a real ambition at privatisation to make a difference and massively increase the level of investment in the environment. And I thought that was an exciting place to be. So in some ways, my sort of coming into work was exactly at the point of privatisation, when there was this huge momentum to shift the dial and essentially take on the challenge of some really big new European directives, Bathing Water Directive, Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. These were all kind of new things at the time, which the previous organisation, as a nationalised company, wasn't able to deal with. But at privatisation, we were able to raise money and actually start driving that. So I suppose it was all that period that got me in. I thought there's a momentum here to make a big difference, and this seems to be a place where you could make a big difference.
Yeah, and it's great that you saw that opportunity, because one of the things that we talk a lot about on our podcast is actually just that change over time, and how many environmental professionals, when they were first starting in their career, didn't even know or understand the range of opportunities related to green jobs. So I think it's nice to see more efforts being put into just a broader range of careers. I mean, even looking at graduates now, they have so many more opportunities going into the sustainability sector now. So yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. And I was looking at your website, and it stresses that the water sector alone can impact 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you can kind of highlight on what is Anglian Water doing to implement more sustainable management of water?
Again, it's a really good question. I suppose just stepping back a minute, a few years ago, and this is probably going back, I say a few years ago, it's probably 15 years ago, we as a company were spending quite a lot of time on adapting to the impact of a changing climate. So we had definitely clocked the fact that climate change was here. And a lot of our efforts were around how do we avoid drought and how do we avoid flood, and what can we do to actually adapt to what was obvious even way back then, a changing climate. But it also became clear to us that we needed to not just lead on adaptation, but we needed to lead on mitigation. It was no good us still having a big carbon footprint and then, I suppose, whinging about the cost of adapting to a changing climate. We needed to show leadership. So we set out our ambition many years ago to be a net zero company, and ultimately net zero by 2030, because we're in a very flat region. We have a big energy use as a result of a lot of pumping goes on. So how can we actually reduce our amount of energy we're using? How can we actually generate more renewables, and how ultimately can we get to a place where we have got a footprint which is zero? Because that's the right thing to do, not just to deal with adaptation, but to think about in parallel the mitigation to a changing climate. Now, the great news about that actually is that not only have we done that, but now all the water companies in the UK have set that ambition and a route map, a really detailed route map about how we go about achieving that trajectory to net zero by 2030. And I mean, the sorts of things you find in there for a company like ours are, can we get demand down? So if we can reduce the amount of water that's used in people's houses, I mean, it has multiple benefits. It reduces the amount of water we take out of the environment, which is a really positive thing. But also, about 16% of the energy used in a house is used to heat up water. So if you reduce the amount of water being used, you reduce your carbon footprint. So just within the house itself, and of course in cost of living, that's even more important for people at the moment. So there's that sort of side of demand. There's also a piece about how do we make sure our performance in terms of having very low levels of leakage is important, because the less water that's leaked, the less water we have to produce, the less energy we have to use, the less carbon we're using. How do we drive energy efficiency across the business? That's a terribly important piece. a big focus on renewables, so anaerobic digestion and advanced anaerobic digestion, where Anglian has actually pioneered some of the very advanced anaerobic digestion techniques to maximise the amount of methane that we're generating from our sludge and producing biosolids. So that's the green energy, which is fantastic. Right the way through to solar. Today, reasonably bright out here in Huntingdon, and as an example, our main water treatment works at Grafham, serving about 1.5 million people, will be running on solar power on a 42,000 panel solar array, which sits around the reservoir at Grafham. So lots of that sort of focus on how can we get the demand down, how can we maximise what we're doing in terms of renewables, and ultimately lower that carbon footprint. So there's a lot. And what's really nice, though, in the water industry is that we're all working together on this. So it's a very sort of open innovation approach to this, and we're sharing experience on this journey, because there's some really tough challenges, particularly in terms of climate change, about, for example, process emissions that we're all having to work on, and drive the science quite hard to understand what's the best approach to this. But the good news is we're all working together, innovating and collaborating, which is fantastic.
Fantastic. Well, it's just great to hear about the leadership that you're taking in that, and again about the collective innovation at Society for the Environment. We're really big on that cross-sector collaboration, because we're all working towards the same objective in terms of climate change. So that's great to hear.
Yes.
And then thinking about your professional development, could you give us an explanation of why you decided to become a Chartered Environmentalist?
I suppose at the heart of it is, this is the business we're in. It's the heart of the business. One of the things I often reflect on is that people sometimes add things on, and they say, well, sustainability is like an add-on, or it's a department, or it's another bit of the business. For me, it is the business. This is what we're about. Unless we are focused as an organisation on being sustainable, unless we're focused on the environment, then we're missing the fundamental point about what we do. Ultimately, we take water from the environment to provide to customers, and we treat it and return it to the environment. And it's really important in that process that not only do we not damage the environment, but actually we enhance the environment. So it's the lifeblood of what we do. So when I was thinking way back in my career about what were the things that were important for me to be focused on, it was pretty obvious that increasing my knowledge and increasing my network around the environment was going to be really, really important. And it's continued to be that way. I mean, it's not this is not a static thing. I mean, there's not a day goes by, frankly, in this business where I don't learn something I didn't know before and think, blimey, I probably should have known that. But it's so I suppose that the simple answer to it is it was fairly obvious to me. This was right at the heart of what was needed to make this business successful. And a successful water company is a really good thing for the environment and a really good thing for the societies that it serves.
Thank you. That's a great explanation. So what has been your proudest achievement over the course of your professional career?
Well, blimey. I suppose if I think in the more recent past, we've spent for many, many years across the water industry, we were very, very good at planning for water resources within our own geographies. So when I say planning for water resources, it's sort of what are the requirements for public water supply over a quarter of a century. We'd be very good in Anglian at developing a 25-year plan for what treatment works were needed, what reservoirs were needed. But a few years ago, it became obvious that wasn't the approach that was needed for the future. We needed to have a national approach to the planning for water resources. And we needed to involve within the regions, not just people who are interested in public water supply, water companies, but we needed to involve other users of water. We need to have, rather than thinking about the environment further down the process of planning, it needed to be involved right at the beginning, rather than thinking about agriculture and other users of water at the end of the process or part way through the process. We need to think about them right at the beginning. So, and the other thing was we used to deal with quite sort of static scenarios for the future. So we imagine that we we knew where growth was going to be for housing, and we knew what the change to climate was going to be, and then we build a sort of safety margin. I mean, these broad generalizations, but that was essentially how it worked. And probably what we needed in light of the uncertainty around particularly climate change was much more scenario-based planning, and probably more flexibility in the ultimate systems we built within the company and between companies, because we can no longer assume it's just always going to be raining in the Northwest and United Utilities and in the Lake District. We can't assume it's always going to rain there, because actually in some ways they've had more droughts in recent years than we have. It's one of those things where, so how do we deal with all of that? So one of the proudest achievements was actually leading a piece of work which led to a rethink across the water industry. And we now, as an industry, plan together. We plan in these regions. We think much more about the other users of water, and Water Resources East, which we have in the east of England, focus a lot on what the environment needs, what agriculture needs, what other sectors need, not just public water supply. And we work together with other companies. So we're developing schemes that involve exports and imports between companies, so that we know what each company is doing. And in that way, we're coming up with the best solution for the environment and society more generally. And Anglian as a company, we led that work. I mean, Jean Spencer, who was our regulation director at the time, led it, and continues actually to lead it, even though she's retired from Anglian now. And what that's unlocked is an approach across the country which is very, very different. So our regulators have developed mechanisms to more quickly develop schemes, better coordinate those schemes, which is fantastic. Water companies are working together much more collaboratively than ever on these schemes, and there's some really exciting stuff coming out from that. And the other one, I suppose, that springs to mind would be probably that leadership that we provided as a company around net zero, which I think ultimately has led to all companies committing to net zero. We're particularly proud of the fact that not only do we address operational emissions in Anglian, but we also focus on capital carbon or embodied carbon. We set a baseline for all the things we build back in 2010, and we're currently at 63% lower capital carbon, embodied carbon, than we were in 2010. So this is on building pipelines and treatment works and all the assets we build. So we're not only reducing our operational emissions, we're reducing the carbon that's going into the materials that we're building, and that actually is a huge advance, and we're really, really proud as a company of those things. But none of these things, have been done, by me. They've all been done by the great people who work in Anglian, and we've had some nice awards through the period. I mean, it's particularly nice to get the Queen's Award for Sustainability, which was a fantastic award, and obviously even more relevant now that she's no longer with us.
Yeah, and but I would also say that I think it's really important to stress the personal role that you've played in that, and that is why you have been recognised on this list by your clients or your competitors or whoever named you. So I think it's fantastic that you've worked towards that. Have you been inspired by any other environmental professionals?
Oh, most definitely. I have to say it's a huge honour, which I don't feel I deserve, like lots of things. But thank you for those comments. Yes, absolutely. I mean, people I talk to now. I mean, fortunately, a lot of these people I still have ongoing relationships with, and I know. So Tony Juniper, I think, is a fantastic example of somebody who has relentlessly driven an environmental agenda and has written some absolutely fantastic and thought-provoking stuff over the years. What has nature ever done for us is a book, one of the more recent ones, which is just probably engaged me more with soil than I'd ever thought about before. That I came away from reading that book thinking, actually, I've got to get my head a lot more around the role of soil and the criticality of it. At one level, it's fairly obvious, but another level, when you read some of the work and the research he's done, it's absolutely fantastic to get your head around. So Tony continues to be somebody I'm inspired by. I suppose, King Charles as well. Over the years as a company, we've done quite a lot through lots of projects with him when he was Prince of Wales, and genuinely he was enlightened, I think, before the lights came on for many people. And for people who I suppose are a bit, who haven't sort of met him and seen the enthusiasm, and it's genuine and it's deep as well. And it's not. This is not a superficial thing. He's an absolutely passionate environmentalist and cares deeply about what we're doing to the planet. And he's impressed me. And every single time I've met him, he's always been incredibly challenging. But I've always come away feeling, that was actually an appropriate challenge. And yes, I need to think about that. So he's been fantastic. So I mean, quite a few. I mean, Craig Bennett as well. I mean, Craig. I know Craig pretty well now. I worked with him over many years. Again, really inspiring. But then at a grassroots level as well. I mean, some of those roles, some of those people I've just talked about are sort of obviously got national roles and have written and on some of the big issues. But when you get down to some of the stuff that's being done by the rivers trusts, for example, in Anglian's region, there's people like David Diggins, who's the chief exec of the Norfolk's Rivers Trust, who's an absolutely incredible, passionate advocate for putting those rivers in Norfolk back to how they should be. That rewiggling that I talked about earlier, and how do we actually improve the river water quality in Norfolk? What can we do? How do we think about this at a higher level? How do we get all of the landowners working with the water companies, with the highways, and with the local authorities, so that we all make a positive difference to the river water quality, and don't assume that it's just a farmer's fault or a water company's fault or an individual? And there's somebody who, again, at a very local level, in Norfolk, has made a huge difference. It has really impressed me and inspired me, although he'd be incredibly embarrassed if he heard me saying it.
Well, hopefully he hears this. It's very insightful to hear that about King Charles, and sounds promising, hopefully, to have an environmental king. And also going back to what you said about reading, inspiring writing about the environment, I think that's something that we should all do, because it's that passion that will drive changes in the future, I think. So thank you for sharing. And I suppose you've answered my next question, really, about how leaders can inspire others to take more challenges on in the environment. But if you could look back then, what's some advice that you would give yourself at 18 about whether it's your career or in terms of sustainability or even generally?
I mean, I've been asked that question before, and I always find it a very difficult one to answer. So I've answered it two ways. I mean, the first one is, in some ways, I almost wouldn't give myself any advice, because the mistakes I've made over the years have sort of helped shape what I do and how I do it. And the things I've got right, the things I've learned from, they've helped shape kind of how I am. So I'm not. You can go back and sort of say, well, could you have done that differently? But if I'd done it differently, would I have learned as much from it? I don't know. So it's a really difficult one. But I've often thought about actually some of the muck and bullets, as I described it, I've been through in my career, because I've spent quite a lot of time, not just in this country, but working all the way around the world, has helped to, I think, positively shape the way in which I go about what I do. So I suppose but the one thing I probably would say to myself is, always keep your mind open, and always keep exploring, always learn, or keep learning, and never, if you haven't stopped trying, you haven't ever failed. So sometimes I think when you're younger, you can get in your mind that there's success or failure, and if you don't achieve something, it's the end of the world. Quite often, it's if you don't think about it like that, but you think about, okay, that hasn't gone as I wanted it to, but what have I learned from it? What can I take forward for the next time? It's a much more positive mindset to have, and I think probably that's the bit of advice I'd give. I'd say, look, you're going to face loads of stuff, but just learn, just keep your mind open, always be exploring, always keep, and recognise that you finish doing your GCSEs or O-levels, as they were in my day, or your A-levels, or if you go to college or whatever. These are just milestones along the way. You never ever stop learning. It's just that, it's, as I said earlier, the reality is I learn something new every day that I didn't know, and never ceases to amaze me how ignorant I am, actually. But there we are. But keep your mind open.
Yes, I definitely agree. I think one of the main challenges, maybe for young people entering the environmental sector, or just young people in general, really, who are starting their early career, is probably that resilience and that grit, which I sometimes feel maybe in my generation is less prevalent, or maybe it's more prevalent in some ways and less so in others. But I also think that I agree with what you said. That I think there's a statistics actually that 90% of people wouldn't go back and change their mistakes if they could, because to erase those mistakes is to erase who you are. So I definitely agree. All of those experiences are formative,
Yeah.
and without them, I think we all wouldn't be who we are. So no, it's interesting to hear your insights on that. Thank you. And what's next for you? Do you have anything exciting coming up? Any new projects? Any new positions, maybe?
Yes, it's a very exciting time for us as a company and as an industry. So, actually, shortly after this interview, I'm joining the National Infrastructure Commission, and we're going to be talking to them about two enormous reservoirs that we're building, one in South Lincolnshire and one in Cambridgeshire. And these are, for those of you who know that, these are like the size of Grafham water. So 55 billion litres of water, huge opportunities. And they've got to be built essentially by 2035. So we're not talking about, huge amount of time away. The opportunity there is enormous. If we do them in the way we want to do them, the opportunity to manage water for public water supply, manage water for amenity, manage water to increase biodiversity, manage water to improve flood risk, manage water to improve agricultural productivity, and get the right sort of balances is huge, absolutely huge. So they're really, really exciting projects. At this moment in time, we've got some really big projects underway currently. So we're laying a pipeline from the Humber Bank, so Scunthorpe and Grimsby, right the way down to Colchester in the southeast. So it's over 400 kilometres, and this is a pipeline which is nearly a metre in diameter. And what that's doing is it's bringing water from an area where we do have a bit of water in Anglian, and generally we don't have a lot of water in Anglian region, but that's where we do have some up on the Humber Bank. We're bringing it down through the region and interconnecting with lots of existing systems. And what that's going to enable us to do is to reduce the amount of water that we take out of the environment, particularly from those aquifers, those underground stores of water which feed lots of the really precious chalk rivers and streams that we've got in the region. And that, together with an enormous smart metering program we've got going at the moment, which is another exciting one where most of our customers are metered, but we're putting in smart meters, because we know when we put a smart meter in and we do it the way we do it, we see a significant reduction in the amount of water that customers are using. And that, together with driving leakage down from already the lowest level in the industry, but another 30 million litres a day reduction there, those two things combined together with the pipeline actually mean that we can reduce the amount of water we take out of the environment by about 85 million litres a day, which is, 33, 34 Olympic-sized swimming pools per day of water that we won't be taking out of the environment. And these are projects on now, all of which will be completed by 2025. So making sure we deliver on those is really, really important. And then we've got a really exciting initiative which we launched with Severn Trent called Get River Positive. And that's a fantastic initiative where we are doing everything from the monitoring we do on combined sewer overflows to ensure that we're not having an adverse impact on the environment, right the way through to funding citizen science, through to opening up inland bathing sites, so that there are options for people to actually go, bathing in inland waters like they currently can at Rutland Water, opening up more of those, opening up our data and being much more transparent about what we do, because there's an awful lot of nonsense written about what we do as a company. Well, one of the ways to tackle that is to say, well, come and have a look. You can see what we do. There's nothing to be hidden here. This is exactly what we do. And open sourcing that data, turning that data into information so people can genuinely look at it and see what's happening. And the opportunities, I think, moving forward for us are to work with partners in a very different way. So it's crazy to assume that the reason that rivers in the UK are not achieving good ecological status is because of water companies, full stop. And therefore to assume that is about water companies, because the reality is it's a combination of lots of things. It's a combination of the fact that lots of rivers, particularly in our region, are heavily modified. They're those channels just draining water out to, in a very straight channel out to the sea. That's not very helpful when you're talking about trying to increase ecological quality and increasing biodiversity. It's about nutrients, phosphates and nitrates, which is, yes, there's a contribution from water companies as part of what we do. We have to be taking phosphate out and continue to take phosphates out, but also there's obviously a massive agricultural input to that. There's issues associated with things like septic tanks and runoff from highways, with microplastics. The answer to all of that and the way in which we get to good ecological status is everybody working together against a common outcome where we can all join together and say, what are we trying to achieve for this stretch of river? And there's some very exciting work that we're doing alongside housing developers and local authority and the Environment Agency and lots of really progressive landowners in Norfolk in order to get a common approach to that. So we say for this stretch of river, okay, who's going to do what? What are the things that are actually going to make the biggest difference? Is it actually re-wiggling the river and reducing phosphate at a couple of taking phosphate down at a couple of water recycling centres even further? Is it about putting in treatment wetlands, which we've got the biggest programme in the UK on at the moment, where we add to an existing water recycling centre, if you like, a natural treatment option where we build wetlands, and again we've got about 26 of those going in. Is it about focusing on highway runoff in a particular area? Is it about removing discharges from septic tanks at the headwaters? What is it for this particular stretch of river? And let's join together and have a combined approach. And I say we've got some really interesting approaches there, and that I think is going to be a game changer for the environment. And it's really important because we've got to shift the dial on good ecological quality, because whilst we've made kind of great progress since privatisation in so many different areas, the scoreboard still says that we haven't cracked good ecological status in this country. And so whatever it is we've been doing has been successful in so many ways, but it hasn't cracked that one. And that's the next big challenge, I think, for us. That and how do we actually ensure that we're reducing our footprint in terms of climate change and building resilience.
Wow, that's certainly a lot that you've got coming up there. Well, it's exciting to see how that all goes for you. And yeah, it's incredible to hear about the range of what Anglian Water actually does. It's really insightful. So that's all the time we have for today. So thank you so much for answering these questions. It's been an absolute pleasure and just really exciting to learn about what about you personally do, but also what your organisation does on a daily basis. So we look forward to seeing what else you get up to in terms of sustainability and pledge to net zero. And yeah, thank you so much for your time today.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much.
Right then, bye.
Bye.